Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on. Strange Woman Harassed Me at Home by Kath K.R. I'm a woman in my 30s who lives alone in a small house at the head of a quiet cul-de-sac in the UK. The street is a maze of roads away from the main road, which means that other than delivery guys and the occasional salesperson, you very rarely see anyone that you don't recognize. I don't exactly know all my neighbors, but I know what they look like, and I know where they live. I can recognize their cars, etc. This weirdness happened over the space of a few months several years back. I work from home, so I'm usually in, and sometimes I don't have a lot to do. The first day was one of those lazy days. It was about 4 p.m. and I was sitting on the sofa watching some daft shit about alien cover-ups. Someone knocked on the door. I have a surveillance camera hidden in the wooden canopy above the front door, so I checked to see who it was because I wasn't expecting any deliveries, and I couldn't be bothered to deal with a salesperson. It was a woman who looked late 40s to early 50s, very smartly dressed, like really expensive clothes and jewelry. Stuff I could never afford. Most people around here generally couldn't afford it either. We're not an affluent area, and this lady stuck out like a sore thumb. She looked flustered and agitated, glancing towards the back garden before trying to look through the tiny frosted glass window on the front door. I noticed she was carrying a dog's lead, but I didn't see a dog. As it happens, at the far side of my back garden there are 2 hedges. There's the hedge that I own within my property boundaries, and there's a second hedge outside my boundary that's council-owned along with a grassland where people walk dogs. I know for a fact there's a hole in the council-owned hedge which I've reported to the council at least a dozen times over the past decade, and they've done the square root of sod all about it. Because of my hedge, I can't reach it to do anything about it myself. Consequently, when I saw the dog's lead, I thought, shit, I bet her dog has gone through the hole. If it's a big dog, it's not getting into my garden, but if it's a small dog, it might be able to work its way through, and I've always got some cooked meat, so I figured I might be able to lure it out. I'm a dog lover, so of course I want to help this woman if I can. When I was a kid, my own dog went missing for a few weeks, and I thought I was never going to get him back. I was heartbroken for those weeks, but fortunately we did get him back, and ever since I've been extremely sensitive to pets in need. I opened the door and this woman gave me the weirdest look. Like she was expecting someone completely different to answer the door, and that I shouldn't be there. To be fair to her, my mom used to live here too, so I didn't think much of that weird look to begin with. Maybe she was expecting my mom? I said, "Hello," and she just stared at me for the longest 30 seconds before she tried to look past me and asked to see Margaret. I don't know what it is about other people's mistakes, but whenever someone has the wrong number, I always end up apologizing as if it's my fault. So that's what I did. Apologized and told her there was no Margaret at this address. Again, she gave me that look, only this time there was anger behind it. "Yes, there is," she insisted. It occurred to me at that point that I have a relative called Margaret, but she lives about 60 miles away and I haven't seen her in years. Nonetheless, just in case she's got her addresses muddled, I asked, "Are you looking for Margaret, surname here?" But she just hissed at me, "You know exactly who I'm looking for. What have you done with her?" I was absolutely lost at this point. I've lived here for 20 years, and I know the name of the previous owner, so I know she's not asking for them. I also know the names of the neighbors and the names of the people who have lived on the street in the time I've been here since moved. None of them are called Margaret. So all I could do is tell her she's got the wrong address. "No, this is my address here. You're lying." That was a tad alarming. She was at the right address. She hadn't knocked on the wrong door. However, she clearly thought I'd done something to somebody who, to the best of my knowledge, has never lived here. I don't know how long the previous owner had this house, but we must be talking about at least 30 years since anyone called Margaret might have lived here. It's at that point that I notice she subtly wrapped the dog lead around her now clenched fist like she's planning to use it as a weapon. In my youth, I did plenty of self-defense training, so I wasn't exactly scared of her as such, but I was obviously getting a bit concerned about the situation that was brewing. I didn't particularly wish to get involved in a brawl on my doorstep with a complete stranger. I was torn between shutting the door in her face or trying to de-escalate the situation. In the end, I closed the door a little so she got less to aim at and told her, "Look, I don't know who you're looking for, but if you think something's happened to your friend, maybe we should just call the police and let them sort it out." Sure enough, the woman slammed her fist with the lead wrapped around it into my door. I later discovered she'd struck the door hard enough to crack the frosted glass window in the middle of it. She started bleeding from doing it. I mean, it must have hurt, but she didn't flinch or show any sign of pain. What the hell? Any confidence I had in my self-defense classes started to waver here because I'm not used to people who don't feel pain. All I could think now was that she was on something and having a really bad trip. So at that point, I put on my scariest voice and told her to get the fuck back. I let her know I was calling the police, and if she was still there when they got there, she could deal with them because I wasn't dealing with her anymore. She tried to stop me from closing the door, but I shoved her back and managed to get it closed and locked. I made it a point to stand next to the door while I was calling 999 so she could hear me. While I was waiting for the police to turn up, I watched her on the surveillance feed. She moved out of shot multiple times, presumably to check the back of the house, and I heard her calling out for Margaret. A few minutes before the police finally turned up, I saw her kick over my wheelie bins in a rage. But then the most chilling thing happened. She walked back to the front door and literally stared directly into my camera. This camera's pretty well hidden. I'm not saying that nobody could spot it, but most people would only know if it was there if they'd been looking for it. Most people aren't looking for cameras, right? She knew it was there. She must have eyeballed it previously. When? I don't know. I later reviewed all of the footage I had from that day, and she never made eye contact with it once. She never even looked in that direction. I only keep about a week's worth of footage before the oldest footage is overwritten, and I checked everything I had, and she was only on camera that day. All I can think is that she'd been here more than a week prior. While she was staring right into the camera, she flipped me the finger and then made a throat-cutting gesture before walking off. I headed to the window to watch her leave, and she was walking like she didn't have a care in the world. She didn't look back, she just wandered away. The police finally showed up. Good job I wasn't being murdered. They took my statement, and I gave them a copy of the surveillance footage, and that was that. I called a couple of times to follow up, but nothing. Nobody ever called me about it. I won't lie, this shit me up for a few weeks. I moved the knife block closer to the door, though out of sight of any of the windows. I started staying up really late and not getting much sleep, which really didn't help. On some nights I was so scared that I started experiencing auditory hallucinations. I'd hear people who weren't there talking, and because this woman was the cause of all my stress, I heard her voice and the name Margaret most of all. Every time I heard the gate open, it put me on edge. I'd review the surveillance footage every day, and eventually, as the weeks passed and I hadn't heard anything else, I started to regain some of my comfort and just put it down as a weird experience. It didn't last. About 4, maybe 5 weeks after the first encounter, she came back. It was just after midnight. I was in the living room mucking about on my phone with the TV on low volume for some background noise. I heard a car door slam and peeked out the front window. A dark-colored car was parked at the end of my driveway. I couldn't see what model or make it was, but it looked like some sort of estate car. I think Americans call them station wagons, right? I didn't see anyone moving about, but a minute or two later the front gate swung open with its metallic groaning and there was a knock on the door. Even when I'm not involved in a blood feud over imaginary Margarets, I'm not going to answer the door at that time. I checked the surveillance camera, and its night vision made it pretty shitty, but I'm positive it was that woman again. I could even see what I thought was the dog lead. And of course she knows I'm watching her because she looks at the camera again, and I tell you, when someone is already giving you the heebie-jeebies, The way night vision makes people's eyes look like soulless black voids doesn't do much to make you feel better. Suddenly she yelled out, "Shut that fucking racket off and come out here now!" I had the TV on, but as I mentioned, it was on a very low volume. There's no way she could hear it from outside the front door. I couldn't even hear it if I walked into the hallway. I was convinced at this point that she was mentally unwell, so I called the police again. I wanted them to stay on the line, but they just told me that someone would be over soon and to call them back immediately if things escalated. So I was waiting, watching, and just hoping she didn't try starting to smash a window or something. She kicked over my wheelie bins again, don't know what she's got against them, and then yelled something else out, which I couldn't quite make out, but whatever it was enough for one of the neighbors to come out and investigate themselves. I watched the neighbor talking with her for a minute. She was remonstrating about something, wagging her finger towards my front door, but my neighbor eventually was able to get her to leave. He even stuck around for a bit to make sure she'd gone. Sadly, that also means she'd gone before the police turned up again and made me feel like I was a bother to them. Something else. Another statement, handing over more security footage, more nothing. I caught up with my neighbor the next day, and he apologized because it didn't occur to him to make a note of the registration plate. But he told me that she'd said pretty much the same thing as she'd said to me previously. That she wanted to know where Margaret was and what I'd done with her. I'm grasping for answers at this point. Even if she's mentally unwell, the fact that she's sticking to this Margaret story and has the right address makes me think there's something more to this than somebody having a breakdown. Then it clicked. Is Margaret her dog? Does she think that I've stolen her dog? Did she have a dog go through the hole in the back? Does she think I've hurt her dog? Is that what this is about? It'd be another few weeks before she came back. This time at 3 a.m., I was awoken by knocking on the door. A few minutes later, I heard tapping on the bedroom window. I knew it was her. I could hear her say things, but I couldn't really make them out because they were too muffled through the windows. It's like she didn't want to get the neighbor out again, so she was trying to keep it quiet. I jumped out of bed and put some clothes on as quickly as I could. I tried and follow her as best I could as she moved around the outside of the house from room to room, knocking, tapping, and muttering. I think I heard a few coherent words like noise and racket, and I'm pretty sure she called me a bitch, but maybe I was imagining that. I couldn't check the surveillance footage this time because she'd spray painted the damn lens. Not that it'd matter much this time. She wasn't lingering by the front door. I thought about calling the police again, but it had proven to be a waste of time so far, and I got the feeling that if I called them out a third time and she was gone, they were just going to start accusing me of wasting their time, even if I did have evidence. They hadn't been exactly that helpful so far. In the end, I waited by the door and listened for her. Eventually she knocked again, and I called out, "Is Margaret your dog?" Dead silence. Nothing. I couldn't see anything through the frosted glass because it was too dark. I had no idea where she was, and I didn't want to turn the outside lights on. I don't even know why. She knew I was in the house because I called out to her, but I still didn't want to draw any more attention to myself. I ended up standing there for who knows how long. At least an hour, probably more, because the sun started coming up. My heart was going a mile a minute pretty much the whole time. But once when it was bright enough, I started checking through the windows to see if I could see her. Nope, nothing. I tentatively opened the front door and looked outside. I still couldn't see her. I grabbed something to arm myself with just in case. I can't remember what now, and I checked all around the house and the back garden. She wasn't there. As I was heading back to the front door, I spotted the oddest thing. The gate was closed. That gate is physically attached to the side of my house, and when it opens and closes, it makes a fair bit of noise. I'd definitely hear it if someone opened or closed it when I was standing next to the front door. But it was closed. So what did that mean? Did she jump it somehow? It's possible, I guess, but I wouldn't want to try it. Anyway, I opened the gate and headed out to the end of the driveway. I looked around and there was no sign of anyone. I turned back to the house and saw that she'd spray painted "Liar" on the front of my house and left the dog lead on the floor beneath it. That was, thankfully, the last time I ever heard from or saw that woman, but I think she still comes by sometimes. Ever since all this happened, I get these creeped out feelings occasionally at night and check out the window. I don't know whether I'm imagining it or what, but now and again I swear I see a dark-colored estate car out on the street. Not parked at the end of my driveway these days, but I just can't shake the feeling she's in there, watching my house. Perhaps she was looking for her dog, and she keeps thinking that she'll still see me with it. What Happened to BJ? Submitted by Narayan C. I do get a chance fairly often to turn new listeners on to the show Uncle Josh. A topic that comes up sometimes is, what was the most terrifying experience of your life? During one of these conversations, when the question was presented to me, I was able to rehash and revisit something from my youth that to this day takes the cake of me being petrified. When I was about 13 years old, my close friend BJ had just moved to the outskirts of town, which my hometown was about 12,000 people. As soon as you weren't in town, you were in the fields. In fact, the house I grew up on was in a bush street corner. It was a block away from the elementary school I went for all 5 years. And I could ride my bike. Within 15 minutes, I could be in the edges of cornfields. So BJ, his mom, and his younger brother moved out to a farmhouse when his mom inherited a home from her family. A nice 2-story brick home. Pulling into the driveway, it looked like the perfect setting for a horror movie. An old rusty swing set sat behind the house a good 40 feet, and to the left was a dilapidated barn with very old farm equipment. You couldn't get me to explore that thing at night for anything. To the left of the barn were 2 old grain bins which hadn't been used in years. The whole scene was just eerie. This would have been the summer of '93, I believe. We were young heavy metal fans and early in the stage of our experimenting with being in various metal bands. This was my first time visiting his new house and staying the night. And of course, out in the fields, we didn't have a ton to keep us busy. I remember right around when we were getting ready to turn in, listening to some old Ozzy on vinyl, he said, "You want to take a walk?" I never turned down an adventure or the chance to see what kind of fucked up situations we could get into just for the experience, so we went. We each had a small flashlight and he had a pocket knife. I had a throwing tomahawk, which was made by my uncle, and I was just learning how to throw knives, so almost always I had something like that on me. One thing great about the countryside, though, at night was you could see every star in the sky. So as we started on foot, he said, "Hey, you know Tia, who's in our grade? She lives in the closest house to me. Let's stop by and see what she's up to." I said, "Sure. Even better. Girls at night." Country, cornfield, perfect. So we approached Tia's house and heard a bunch of girls hollering behind the house. We walked around the corner of the back of the house, and it was 4 or 5 girls in a swimming pool around midnight. We didn't really know this girl very well, so the last people Tia expected to just creep around the corner of our house was us. But they welcomed us, all giddy, and said, "Get in the pool!" Well, why not? Let's do it. I can't recall how long we ended up swimming, but I do remember her folks weren't home. We got into other trouble, like climbing an old antenna TV tower, and we were jumping off of her roof into the pool. Fun times, for sure. But then we had to leave, so we started the half-mile walk home. And I didn't mention that the whole scene I painted for you with the house and the barn. It was completely surrounded by tall corn stalks. A very deep and vast cornfield surrounded BJ's entire property. About halfway back to his house, walking down this 2-lane dark country road with the only light being the stars other than our little flashlights. It was a really gorgeous setting to see things like that at that time of night. We decided to turn into the field just for the hell of it, and to turn to the right at some point and eventually just make it into his yard. We were going to go about 100 feet or more in a straight line, and then could take a turn literally right, keep walking straight, and be in his yard at some point. So we were walking, just chatting about nothing in particular, and I turned my head to the right. BJ was gone. I didn't see him or hear him walk away, and the entire time I was waiting on Malachi from Children of the Corn to pop out and make me shit myself. But that was just it. BJ was gone. I immediately started yelling his name and shining my dumbass light in all directions around me, during which time I lost all direction of my own, and at that point had no idea which way I was going towards his house, the road, or deeper into the cornfield, or maybe even back towards Tia's house. I mean, that alone was enough to terrify me, even if BJ was right beside me. We were both always jokesters and loved nothing more than to just fuck with each other, but immediately my blood was cold and panic set in like I'd never felt before. I continuously yelled out, "BJ, you fuckhead, where are you? It's not funny anymore." That picked up the pace, which was exactly a knee-jerk reaction. I was continuing to yell his name at high volume just to hear my own voice, giving me some sort of comfort or protection from whatever animals may be around. I'd never felt so helpless, and so many scenarios were playing through my mind every second. I just couldn't understand how in a matter of a second, my friend was by my side and then he was just gone. And then I couldn't figure out how the hell he couldn't hear me. There were no cars or anything in the background. Nothing. I then just made a guess and took off in a full sprint of where to run, knocking down 6-foot-tall stalks of corn and hoping that whatever demon rooster coyote dog was going to end me would stop the whole thing wouldn't come. I can't recall how much time had passed, but finally I came to the edge of the field up against his side yard, and there on the front porch, 50 feet away from me, was BJ. As soon as we made eye contact, he said in this dumb oaf voice, "Dude, what happened to you?" All the fear and panic I'd felt for the last 15 minutes turned to pure anger. I laid into his ass and wanted to smack the piss out of him. He said that he didn't intentionally leave me like that, and just turned toward the right, hoping that I would follow behind him. We sat outside and replayed the whole walk from Tia's to the house. We both replayed those last 30 minutes almost until we passed out, and neither of us could picture when he made that turn, or how the hell he didn't hear me. I remember being pretty jazzed up and spent the rest of the night replaying the entire thing in my head. That was really about the last interaction that I had with my friend BJ. It was a very odd occurrence. And now it's time for one of the classics. My Neighbor Was a Murderer by GoaliePerson00. I've shared a not as creepy event that's happened to me, but this particular occurrence never put me in any jeopardy. It was more my neighbors, but creepy nonetheless. Keep in mind that I am unsure of the exact age I was during this series of events, but it took place over a majority of my life thus far and promptly ended in 2011, when I was about 11. I remember most of these things happening, and my mom has filled me in on some of the details since. Not sure if this belongs here, but I really don't ever want to meet this person again. I lived in a good neighborhood in a good city. It was being built when we moved there, but I always remember these two being my neighbors. Their names were Betty and Jeff. The first interaction I remember having with either of them was when Betty gave my sister and I a whole bunch of McDonald's toys. You know how they display every one of those toys inside? We got one of those displays. I was 5 and my sister was 2, and I remember being ecstatic as any young child would be. My mom later informed me that Betty would tell her that we were the cutest kids in the world, and that she wished she had children like us. Fast forward a few years later, where I'm guessing I was about 7 or 8. I was hanging out with another girl my age, who was also my neighbor down the street. We left my house and we were walking to hers, and when we got outside, we saw Betty throwing a bunch of Jeff's shit out the second-story window. I vividly remember her screaming profanities as she tossed an old TV set out of the window. My friend and I rushed to get inside and just thought that she was crazy. Between the age of 8 and 10, Betty and Jeff must have had a few more fights. There's nothing that I can remember, but I do remember my mother telling me that Betty confronted my dad. My dad had been outside doing yard work at around 8:30 or 9 o'clock at night. It was summertime, so the sun was still out, and the kids were still outside yelling and playing. All of a sudden, Betty marched out of her house and straight to my dad. She yelled at him for keeping everyone awake with the sound of a leaf blower, and probably called him a motherfucker a few times. I would understand her anger more if it was dark out, but it still kind of confuses me. Maybe she did have a right to be angry. One day when I was 10, I had returned home from school to the sight of police cars and a bunch of yellow caution tape surrounding Betty and Jeff's house. I ran inside and asked my mom what had happened, but she had no clue. She later found out from my other neighbor that Betty had died, possibly by being thrown down the stairs or something like that. They were trying to figure out if it was self-inflicted, or if Jeff had finally lost his shit and killed the crazy bitch. A few days later, I was outside by myself drawing with chalk. As soon as I got outside, I saw Jeff walk over to his glass door. He hadn't been arrested for anything yet and was still presumed innocent. I thought I had nothing to worry about, so I continued on and retrieved my chalk from the garage. I began to draw when I noticed that Jeff was staring out his door and staring directly at me. This continued for like 10 minutes. I eventually got creeped the fuck out and went to tell my dad. By the time he came outside with me, Jeff had left the door. That's when I realized that maybe Jeff was the batshit crazy one. In April 2011, Jeff was convicted of aggravated murder and sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 30 years. He had given Betty a fatal dose of antifreeze, and I'm still unsure of whether or not he actually pushed her drug and dead body down the stairs for good measure. After reading an article on it, Betty claimed that Jeff was very abusive and would not let her do anything without his permission. That would explain her behavior, but I'm still not completely convinced that she was entirely innocent either. A new couple has since moved into their house. They're completely normal for what I can tell, knock on wood, and we haven't had any murderous events happen on my streets since. Why I Own a Gun, submitted by Jessica K. This happened in 2004. I was 24 years old, working a very successful career in retail as a store manager, with my whole life in front of me. I was dating a wonderful guy who was just finishing his master's degree and was working for a very prominent advertising agency too. We had been dating for 2 years and things were looking great for us. We had lots of plans for the future and we were just in one of the sweetest spots life could offer us. We had a great group of friends, both his and mine, and we spent a lot of time with them and our families. For this story, I'll call my boyfriend Jeff. We were talking about moving in together as we both had separate apartments in our city. I won't lie, mine was a little bit nicer, but I loved staying with him because he lived closer to the nightlife and the hustle and bustle, whereas I was sort of on the outskirts of our city. His neighborhood wasn't bad, but it wasn't the greatest. One night we were out with some friends and an acquaintance of one of Jeff's friends showed up. I'd never met him before, but was immediately wary of him. He was extremely loud, got extremely drunk at the place we were at, and was just basically out of control. I know we were still fairly young at that point, and most of us at that point, though, were getting that side of our lives under control. We were all starting careers and having plans for the future. This guy clearly didn't. Before the night wrapped up, some other sketchy dudes showed up and started talking with this other guy. He began waving his arms all over the place and yelling something, and I couldn't hear him over the music and the conversation of the rest of our friends. But Jeff and I knew something was wrong. I just had this bad feeling, and Jeff looked at me and said, "Hey, let's get out of here." We said goodbye to our friends and went back to Jeff's place. I was pretty tipsy, but in the mood to fool around, and so was Jeff. He wanted to take a shower real quick when we got home, and I felt like another beer, so I just teased him a little about having to be Mr. Clean, and he ran to the bathroom while I sat down on the couch waiting for him to come back. A little while later, there was a knock at the door, and at first I got up to answer it before thinking, who could possibly be knocking on the door at 2:30 in the morning? I went over to the door and asked who it was, and in a muffled voice, someone said that they were the building superintendent. Being as tipsy as I was, I opened the door, but with the chain on it. That didn't help anything. The door burst inward, hitting me in the forehead and knocked me backwards. I put my hand up to my head as 3 people burst into the room, and before I could even scream or yell, the first person raised his arm and brought it down on my face. The pain was unbelievable, and I immediately sank to the floor. I'd been pistol whipped right across the bridge of my nose and face. I remember everything being in slow motion and crumpling to the ground, only hearing these voices that sounded like they were coming from hundreds of feet away. It was like being on a beach with this constant sound or hum, and then this murmuring behind it. I know I passed out at that point, and I woke up, maybe seconds later, who knows. My face was covered with blood, and it was pooling all around my head as I lay on the floor between the couch and a coffee table. I heard more muffled yelling coming from the back of the apartment, and I remember looking up at the light in the ceiling and seeing these two shapes standing over me. I couldn't make out any details, but there were just two people standing there looking down at me. The yelling grew more intense and back, and things started to flood into my head. I still didn't know what had happened to me, but I knew something was very wrong. That's when the loudest sound I've ever heard in my life came. It was a gunshot, then another. I tried to scream, but I had no energy to do so, and I remember trying to scramble to my feet only to find that my pants had been pulled down around my ankles, with my panties stuck at my knees. The two shapes began yelling at a third that had entered the room, and all of them started to rush out the door. One of them said, and I heard this clearly, the only thing that I did hear clearly, "Fuck, kill her too." While it didn't fully register, I did hear those words. To be honest, I didn't even think it was relevant to me at the time, but it was. The three people left the apartment with the door open and the smoke alarm went off, and it was beeping like all hell, and obviously other people in the apartment building had heard all of this commotion. I could barely move and tried to get up when I suddenly heard screaming from the doorway of the apartment, and I looked up in a reddish haze from the blood in my eyes and saw more shapes coming into the room. At that point, I was completely out of it, but I did hear people yelling to call 911. Eventually, I passed out again, and I didn't wake up until I was in a hospital room, completely unaware of how I had gotten there or what was going on. When I came to in the bright lights, there were all kinds of people in the room with me, doctors and police, and as I slowly came out of things, they started firing questions at me, and I was completely confused. It felt like my brain and face were on fire, and I couldn't focus on any one person. My vision was completely blurred, and I immediately just started screaming for help. I felt a hand squeeze mine and realized it was my dad. The doctors told everyone to get out of the room, and the police were still there asking to speak to me, but the doctors said it would have to wait. I do recall that clearly. I remember trying to cry, and remember straining to see my dad's face, but only hearing his voice and feeling his hand on mine. He was telling me I was going to be okay and that he loved me. I finally did start to cry and asked what was going on, Daddy, and he said I just needed to be quiet and stay with him. The funniest thing is that I remember his smell more than anything. From the time I was a little girl up until now, he's always worn Polo cologne. I can smell it now, even writing this. And back then I remember feeling that too, and how it felt that much safer knowing it was really my dad. He is an unbelievably hard-assed guy. He was very tough on me growing up and set a lot of standards. But he was also the most loving father a girl could want. I was never without anything, but he demanded so much. But he was also my protector. And right now I could tell in his voice that was normally so strong. It was shaking, and he was upset that he hadn't been there to protect me for what had happened. He never said anything, and I never said anything about that, but I could feel it. He did keep reassuring me that I was going to be okay, and that my mom was on her way. She lived a few states away. I fell back to sleep and didn't wake up until late the next day. So here's what happened. My life was ripped from me that night. It took a long time to put everything together, but this is what went down. That sketchy friend that showed up that night was some kind of drug dealer. I'm not going to get into all the ins and outs of that, but he was the catalyst of what happened to me and Jeff. Apparently, the guys who had showed up at the bar that night looking for him were looking for something he owed them. He didn't have it, so he pointed out Jeff and me and said that Jeff had whatever it was they were looking for. I will come out and say it was drugs and money, neither of which Jeff had. We didn't do drugs, not even smoke weed. During the trial that ensued, this guy had to testify under oath that he told these guys the reason Jeff and I were leaving the moment that we did was that we were holding what they wanted. So they followed us home. They broke in. They shot and killed my boyfriend Jeff over nothing. They broke my face in 7 places for nothing. One of the guys was actually going to rape me, hence why my pants were pulled down. And the third guy did nothing to stop any of it. My face took 25 reconstructive surgeries to get it to where it is now. But that's the least of my pain and squabbles about that night. The love of my life was ripped from me for absolutely no reason, other than some guy trying to save himself over bullshit. Pardon me swearing. Coming back from this was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. I lost my vision for nearly 4 months, and the constant surgeries didn't help rehabbing that. The constant stress of police, lawyers, courtroom dates, and the uncontrollable grief I was going through took its toll. Thankfully, I had and still have a great support network around me to make sure that I stayed tough. All the lessons my daddy had taught me were now paying off. I moved back home with him, and he took care of me like never before. My mom did too, although we are pretty estranged, and she left my father for reasons I still don't know about. I don't care to. Maybe someday I'll know, but I've always chalked that up to not my business. She still loves me, and that's all that matters. So the guy who killed Jeff, he got life in prison with no possibility of parole. The other 2 were sentenced to 25 to life with parole possible after 20 years. Despite the one guy who said he did nothing, he still got the same sentence. So that brings me to the title of the story I've sent to you, Uncle Josh. Why I Own a Gun. I know it's controversial these days, and I see all of the horrible stories that happen in the media with maniacs with firearms that shoot innocent people for no reason. But I am convinced, had I had a firearm that night, things might have been very, very different. I'll be damned if I allow anything like that to ever happen to me or my family. I did eventually find another man, my unbelievably amazing, loving, sexy, hot husband Carl. But even now I still once in a while deal with what happened to Jeff. Hard to put something like that behind me 100%, even though it has been so many years. Carl gets it and supports me fully. My kids are awesome. Life is as good as I could ever ask for it to be. I survived a horrific event, even though I don't quite look the way I used to. And the age doesn't help either, laughing out loud. My dad had taught me to shoot growing up, but I was always wary of owning my own firearm. I'm not a Ted Nugent nut about them, but we do have firearms strategically placed around our house for safety. Our children have been taught everything they need to know about them and to respect them. And when they were old enough, we began taking them to the range too to shoot. I have a fully licensed concealed carry permit for my own safety, but also for my business. I don't leave the house without one. It's not for everyone, but it's for me. What happened to me is why I own a gun. I want to end this very long story by saying that, please, everyone, be careful with whom you cross paths with. Anything can happen in this life. I was not expecting this to happen to me, but it did happen to me. You certainly can't vet every single person you meet or that will enter your life, but you can be as diligent as possible. If something is weird or a situation seems odd, get your butt out of there as fast as possible. Protect those around you and yourself. Check up on your friends. Check up on your kids. Make sure you know who they're hanging out with. The events in my life have made me who I am today. They've made me stronger, but they also broke me down to the point where I didn't even want to go on some days. To the 3 men who entered that apartment and destroyed 2 lives, one permanently, I have forgiven you. I do not forgive what you did, but I forgive you for doing it. That doesn't mean I like you. That doesn't mean I'm on your side. That doesn't mean I will not show up to every parole meeting for the rest of your life to make sure you do not have the ability to get out and lead a life like the rest of society. You are being punished for your actions. That's all there is to it. To my family and friends, I love you all. Thank you for always being by my side. I'd never heard of your channel until 2 weeks ago. A friend of mine is a fan, and she said I should share my story with you because you read stories with impunity and you don't share your opinion. I hope and trust that this is the case with my story. Thanks for listening, everybody. Stay safe. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. If you have a true scary story of any nature that you'd like to hear narrated on this channel or my podcast, email it to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. Please like, share, and subscribe to my channel. Hit the notification bell for every time that I upload something. And of course, follow me on social media. All the links to that are in the description below. If you'd like to take your support a step further, find me on Patreon. There's a link down there for that. And of course, visit my storefront on tpublic.com. A link to that is below. More fun designs coming. I know I've been promising those, but there's some cool ones in there. Chupacabras, Bigfoot, all kinds of fun stuff. Get yourself some swag. Supports the channel. Thanks for all your well wishes. I am feeling much better. Not 100%, but we're getting there. Everyone, be excellent to each other. And until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.